The December wind howled through the valley like a wounded beast, carrying with it sheets of snow that cut through the air like frozen knives. The Montana Territory in 1878 was no place for the weak, and on this bitter night, it seemed determined to prove that truth once more. Margaret Sullivan pulled the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to stop the cold that had already seeped deep into her bones. Her dress, once a modest blue calico that Thomas had admired on their wedding day, now hung in tatters, the hem blackened with mud and torn from her desperate journey through the wilderness. Each step through the knee-deep snow sent fresh agony through her feet, wrapped only in what remained of her boots, the soles worn through to nothing. She had been walking for 2 days now, or was it 3? Time had lost meaning somewhere between leaving the charred remains of her cabin and stumbling through this endless white hell. The people of Cedar Ridge had made it clear she was no longer welcome. After Thomas died in that logging accident, crushed beneath a falling pine, the vultures had descended quickly. The bank took the land, claiming debts she never knew existed. The general store refused her credit. Even the church women, who had smiled so sweetly when Thomas was alive, now crossed the street to avoid her. "Widow Sullivan's got the devil's luck," she'd heard Mrs. Patterson whisper. "First her parents to the fever, now her husband. Best keep our distance." Margaret sank to her knees beside a towering pine, its branches heavy with snow. The tree offered little shelter, but she no longer had the strength to search for better. Her fingers, blue-tinged and numb, fumbled with the small silver cross at her throat. Thomas's wedding gift, the last thing of value she owned that the creditors hadn't taken. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like dried leather. "Please, Lord, I have endured all I can. If this is to be my end, let it be swift." The prayer came out in puffs of frozen breath, disappearing into the darkness. She thought of Thomas, of his gentle hands and easy laugh, of the dreams they'd shared of children and prosperity, all of it buried now beneath 6 feet of frozen earth in the Cedar Ridge Cemetery, a plot she couldn't even afford to mark properly. The cold was becoming almost warm now, a dangerous sign she recognized even through her delirium. Death wore many faces in the frontier, and hypothermia's was among the kindest. She closed her eyes, ready to surrender to that false warmth, when she heard it. The soft nicker of a horse through the storm. Samuel Hayes had been tracking a stray mare since dawn, one of his best breeding stock that had broken through the fence during yesterday's storm. At 32, he'd spent half his life building his ranch in this unforgiving country, learning to read the weather like scripture. Tonight's storm was turning deadly, and he knew he should have turned back hours ago, but that mare represented months of work and hope for expanding his herd. He guided his stallion, Tempest, carefully through the drifts, trusting the animal's instincts more than his own snow-blinded eyes. The tracks had led him far from his usual range, into the thick pine forests that bordered his property. He was about to give up, to turn back and accept the loss, when Tempest suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. "What is it, boy?" Samuel murmured, squinting through the swirling snow. Then he saw it, a huddled shape at the base of a pine tree. So still it might have been a snow-covered rock, but something in the way Tempest snorted, pawing nervously at the ground, told him different. He dismounted carefully, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. As he approached, the shape resolved into something that made his heart skip. A woman, curled into herself like a child, her dress nothing but rags against the killing cold. For a moment, he thought he was too late, that he'd found nothing but another frontier tragedy. Then he heard it, barely audible above the wind, a whisper, weak but unmistakably alive. He knelt beside her, his gloved hands gentle as he turned her face toward him. Even in the dim light, he could see lips turned blue, frost clinging to her eyelashes like tiny diamonds. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed with approaching death. "Ma'am?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Those eyes, gray as the winter sky, struggled to focus on his face. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Samuel didn't waste time on further questions. He'd seen enough death in his years to know how close she stood to that final threshold. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the frontier had already claimed most of her substance, leaving only the stubborn spirit that had kept her moving this far. "No, please," the words came out as barely a breath. Let me be." "Not happening," Samuel said firmly. Carrying her to Tempest, the horse stood steady as he somehow managed to mount while holding her, settling her across the saddle in front of him. "You're not dying on my land, not tonight." The ride back to his cabin was the longest of his life. He kept one arm tight around the woman, holding her against his chest, trying to share what warmth he could. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't make out. Once, clear as a bell, she said, "Thomas," and something in the hope in that single word made his jaw clench. His cabin appeared through the storm like a beacon, a simple structure of hewn logs and chinking, but solid and warm. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Thank God. He'd banked the fire before leaving, a habit that might now save a life. Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency. The cabin was one room, sparse but clean, a bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with preserves and supplies. He laid her on the bed, his only bed, and set about building up the fire until it roared, filling the space with blessed heat. Only then did he truly see the state of her. Beyond the torn dress and shoeless feet, he saw the gauntness of prolonged hunger, the bruising of exposure, the 1,000 small defeats written in scars and wear. Yet, beneath it all, there was something else, a face that would have been beautiful if life had been kinder. Delicate features that spoke of gentler origins than the frontier usually allowed. He heated water, found clean blankets, and faced a dilemma as old as decency itself. Her wet clothes would kill her as surely as any bullet, but propriety demanded restraint. Samuel Hayes was many things. A loner, a man hardened by loss, someone who'd chosen the company of horses over humans, but he was no brute. In the end, practicality won. Moving as quickly and impersonally as possible, he wrapped her in layers of warm blankets, hanging her pitiful dress by the fire to dry. He pulled his one chair close to the bed, settling in for what would be a long vigil. As the hours passed and color slowly returned to her cheeks, Samuel found himself studying her face, wondering what tragedy had driven her to nearly die in a winter storm. The frontier was full of such stories, dreams broken against the hard reality of this unforgiving land. He'd lived his own version of that tale, after all. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the cabin, warmed by fire and human presence, death's grip began to loosen. The woman's breathing deepened, becoming less labored. Once, her eyes opened fully, focusing on his face with sudden clarity. Fear flashed across her features, the instinctive terror of a woman finding herself helpless in a stranger's power. Samuel held up his hands, keeping his voice low and calm, the same tone he used with spooked horses. "You're safe," he said simply. "Storm caught you. You're in my cabin, about 5 miles north of Cedar Ridge. Name Samuel Hayes. You're safe," he repeated, knowing words meant little but hoping the tone would convey what language couldn't. She studied him for a long moment, those gray eyes searching his face for truth. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, for the tension slowly left her body. Her eyes closed again, but this time in healing sleep rather than deadly surrender. Samuel fed the fire and settled back in his chair. Outside, the storm raged on, but for now, at least they were safe. He'd given her his bed, his warmth, his shelter. Come morning, there would be questions, complications, the harsh realities of a woman's reputation and a man's intentions in a land that judged harshly and forgave little. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he'd simply done what any decent man would do, saved a life because he could, because turning away would have made him less than human. As he watched her sleep, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that somehow in saving her. The threads of both their fates had become forever intertwined. The storm would pass, as all storms did. What remained to be seen was what would grow in the aftermath of this strange, frozen night when mercy had overcome the cruel mathematics of survival, and two broken souls had found shelter in the most unexpected of places. The cabin was simple but sturdy, built by hands that knew the value of honest work. Pine logs fitted tight with clay chinking kept out the worst of the wind, while the stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by countless fires. The furniture was sparse but well made, a single bed with a corn-husk mattress, a table scarred by years of use, 2 chairs, and shelves holding neat rows of preserves, coffee, beans, and flour. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint sweetness of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Margaret woke to these unfamiliar scents, her mind struggling to piece together where she was. The last thing she remembered clearly was the snow, the terrible cold, and then warmth. A man's voice, gentle despite its roughness, strong arms lifting her from the snow. She sat up too quickly, and the room spun. Only then did she realize she was in a bed, a real bed with clean blankets that smelled of lye soap and sunshine. Her dress hung by the fire, dry now but beyond salvation, its tears and stains a testament to her ordeal. Easy there. The voice came from near the fire. The man, Samuel, she remembered, sat in a chair, a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked tired, stubble darkening his jaw, but his eyes were alert and watchful. "You've been asleep near 14 hours. Figured you needed it." Margaret pulled the blankets higher, acutely aware of her vulnerability. You saved me." "Found you half frozen by a pine tree," he said matter-of-factly. "Couldn't very well leave you there." She studied him in the morning light filtering through the single window. He was perhaps 30, maybe a bit older, with the weathered look of a man who spent his days under the open sky. Dark hair that needed cutting, hands scarred from work, clothes that were clean but patched. Not handsome in the way Thomas had been, but there was something solid about him, like he'd been carved from the same stone as the mountains. "She was shivering in rags," Samuel said quietly, almost to himself. The rancher gave her his bed to rest. He gestured toward the floor where a bedroll lay. "I slept there. Wanted you to know that straight off. I'm not. I wouldn't." "I believe you," Margaret said, surprised to find it was true. There was something in his manner, a careful distance he maintained even while showing kindness, that spoke of respect. An awkward silence stretched between them. Samuel broke it by standing, moving to the stove with practiced efficiency. "You must be hungry. When's the last time you ate?" Margaret tried to remember. 3 days, maybe 4. There were some berries, but she trailed off, unwilling to relive those desperate hours. He didn't press, just set about making breakfast. Soon the cabin filled with the smell of bacon, biscuit, and coffee. When he set the plate before her, Margaret had to fight not to wolf it down like an animal. She forced herself to eat slowly, aware of his eyes on her. "Thank you," she said when finished. "For everything. I should go. I've imposed enough." "Go where?" His tone was mild, but the question cut deep. Margaret looked down at her hands, still pink from the cold. "I don't know. Away from Cedar Ridge, somewhere they don't know me." "In that dress, in December, with no shoes?" He shook his head. "Ma'am, I'm not one to pry into folks' business, but seems to me you're running from something more than just the cold." The kindness in his voice nearly undid her. She'd faced cruelty, indifference, judgment, but simple human decency, that was harder to bear. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she said finally. "Widow Sullivan. They call me in town, like it's a disease that might be catching." Samuel poured more coffee, his movements deliberate and calming. "I knew a Thomas Sullivan once. Good man. Worked at Henderson's logging camp." "My husband." The words came out thick. "Dead these 3 months. A tree fell wrong. They said, after that," she gestured helplessly. "The bank took our land, said there were debts. The store wouldn't extend credit, even the church women. She stopped, pride warring with honesty. They said I had devil's luck, that I was cursed. People can be cruel when they're afraid, Samuel said. And nothing scares folks more than seeing how quick a life can fall apart. Reminds them it could happen to them. Margaret looked up, surprised by the understanding in his voice. You sound like you know something about that. A shadow crossed his features. Lost my family to scarlet fever 6 years back. Parents, sister, her 2 little ones. I was out on a cattle drive. Came back to empty houses and fresh graves. Folks avoided me too after that, like death was something you could catch just by standing too close. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Margaret understood now why he lived alone, why he'd built this cabin far from town. Sometimes the only way to heal was to retreat from those who insisted on seeing you as broken. I can work, she said suddenly. I'm not asking for charity. I can cook, clean, mend. I can earn my keep until I figure out where to go. Samuel considered this, sipping his coffee. Can't say I'd mind a cooked meal that doesn't taste like boot leather, and these clothes could use better mending than I can manage. He gestured to his patched shirt. But folks'll talk if they find out you're here. Let them talk, Margaret said, surprising herself with the vehemence. What more can they do to me? Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a recognition of shared defiance against a world that had taken too much. There's a small room off the back. Used to be for storage, but it's got a window. You could make it comfortable enough. Wouldn't be proper. You sleeping in here? It was more than she'd dared hope for. Shelter, work, dignity. I accept, she said simply. Samuel nodded, then stood abruptly. I need to check the horses, see if that mare made it back on her own. Storm's passed, but there'll be drifts to clear. He grabbed his coat from a peg. There's more food if you're hungry. Water in the pitcher. I'll bring in more wood when I return. After he left, Margaret explored the cabin slowly, her strength still fragile. Everything was neat, orderly, but with the sterile quality of a place missing a woman's touch. No curtains on the window, no tablecloth, no small graces to soften the harsh utility. She found the storage room he'd mentioned, barely larger than a closet, but with a small window and space for a cot. By the time Samuel returned, arms full of firewood, she had washed the dishes and was examining his pile of mending. He stopped in the doorway, something flickering across his face at the domestic scene. Found one of my mother's old dresses in a trunk, he said gruffly, setting down the wood. Might fit with some taking in, better than what you've got. The dress was faded blue wool, years out of fashion but clean and whole. Margaret held it up, tears threatening. Such a simple kindness. Yet it meant everything. I'll pay you back, she whispered. Somehow, I'll pay you back for all of this. Samuel busied himself with the fire, uncomfortable with gratitude. No debts here, Mrs. Sullivan. We do what needs doing, that's all. That night, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they worked in companionable silence, she with her needle, he cleaning his rifle. The wind had calmed, leaving only the pop of the fire and the occasional stamp of horses in the lean-to outside. Why? Margaret asked suddenly. Why help me? You don't know me. I could be everything they say, cursed, trouble, a woman of poor character. Samuel looked up from his rifle, meeting her eyes directly. Maybe because I remember what it's like to have folks turn away. Maybe because this land's hard enough without us being hard to each other too. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Or maybe because when I saw you in that snow, I saw someone who hadn't given up yet. Even when giving up would have been easier. Takes a special kind of strength to keep walking when you've got nothing left. Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks, the first she'd allowed herself since Thomas died. Samuel pretended not to notice, returning his attention to his rifle, granting her the privacy of her grief. Later, settled in the storage room with fresh blankets and the borrowed dress hanging on a nail, Margaret lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else's home. Samuel's steady footsteps as he banked the fire, the creak of his bed, The gradual descent into silence. For the first time in months. She wasn't cold, wasn't hungry, wasn't alone. It terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. This fragile safety that could be snatched away as quickly as everything else had been. But for tonight, she would accept it, hold it close like the warm blankets around her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The reality of their arrangement, the judgment of others if discovered, the need to rebuild some kind of life from the ashes of the old. But tonight, in this simple cabin with its solid walls and steady warmth, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. In the main room, Samuel lay awake on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He'd grown comfortable in his solitude, built walls as sturdy as his cabin to keep the world at bay. Now, a woman with gray eyes and sorrow-bent shoulders had walked through those walls like they were morning mist. He told himself it was just Christian charity, simple human decency. But he knew that was only part of the truth. Something in Margaret Sullivan called to something in him, perhaps the shared understanding of loss, perhaps the quiet strength he sensed beneath her desperation. Whatever it was, his carefully ordered world had shifted on its axis. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, covering the harsh landscape in forgiving white. Inside, two wounded souls began the delicate process of learning to trust, separated by thin walls and thick propriety, but bound now by the oldest currency of the frontier, mutual need and unspoken understanding. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. Such a simple act. Yet, in this hard land where kindness came dear, it was everything. It was a beginning. The first weeks passed in careful routine. Margaret rose before dawn, stoking the fire and preparing breakfast while Samuel tended the horses. She found purpose in small tasks, patching his worn shirts with tiny, perfect stitches, scrubbing years of bachelor neglect from the cabin corners, transforming simple ingredients into meals that made him pause mid-bite with surprised appreciation. Samuel maintained a respectful distance, always knocking before entering the cabin if she was alone inside, never lingering in the evening after supper. Yet Margaret noticed things, how he'd begun taking more care with his appearance, trimming his beard regularly, even attempting to tame his unruly hair. She caught him once standing in the doorway, watching her knead bread, a look of such profound loneliness on his face that her heart ached. "You make the place feel alive," he said one morning, apropos of nothing, then colored and hurried out to the barn. Margaret understood. The cabin had transformed under her care. Curtains made from flour sacks now framed the windows. Wild flowers dried from summer filled a jar on the table, and the constant aroma of baking bread or simmering stew gave the space a warmth that transcended mere temperature. She learned Samuel's rhythms as she mended his clothes. He was a man of deep stillness, speaking more to his horses than to her most days. But in the evenings, as they sat by the fire, she sometimes coaxed stories from him, tales of cattle drives, of building this ranch with his own hands, of the family he'd lost. "Sarah was just 6, he said one night, staring into the flames. Used to follow me everywhere, chattering like a magpie, called me Sammy, no matter how much I protested." His voice roughened. "The fever took her last. I think she waited for me to come home." Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward his, then stopped. The space between them, mere inches, felt vast as a canyon. "She knew you loved her," she said softly. "Children always know." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition of shared grief, perhaps, or something deeper. The moment stretched until Samuel cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "Early morning tomorrow. That north fence won't mend itself." It became their pattern, drawing close, pulling away, circling each other like wary animals learning trust. Margaret found herself watching for his return each day, her heart lifting at the sound of Tempest's hooves. Samuel began bringing small gifts from his trips to check the property, a handful of late berries, interesting stones, once a hawk feather that made her smile. The storage room had become comfortable under Margaret's touch. Samuel had helped her move in a proper cot, and she'd sewn a cheerful quilt from fabric scraps. Still, some nights she lay awake, listening to him moving in the main room, fighting the improper urge to seek the warmth of human companionship. One evening, as January deepened its grip, Samuel surprised her. "Would you? That is, I thought you might help me with the ledgers. My writing's poor, and the numbers need checking before I order spring supplies." It was an excuse. They both knew Samuel's writing, while unpracticed, was perfectly adequate, but Margaret accepted the fiction, settling beside him at the table, their heads bent over columns of figures. She was acutely aware of his presence, the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to him, the way his hand trembled slightly as he pointed to entries. "You've done well," she said, reviewing his careful records. "This ranch is prospering." "It's just land and cattle," he said quietly. "Never felt like much until—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "Until?" Margaret prompted, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel's hand covered hers on the ledger, work roughened but gentle. "Until I had someone to share it with, even if it's just this way." The weight of his hand was warm, solid, real. Margaret turned her palm up, lacing her fingers through his. They sat frozen, hands clasped, both afraid to move forward, unable to pull back. A log shifted in the fire, breaking the spell. Samuel withdrew his hand carefully, as if she might shatter. "I should check the horses." "It's past 10 o'clock, Margaret said. "The horses are fine." He looked at her, a muscle working in his jaw. "Margaret." Her given name on his lips was intimate as a caress. "I'm trying to do right by you. Your reputation—" "My reputation is already ruined," she interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I'm a penniless widow living unchaperoned with a bachelor rancher. What they think in town can't matter less than it already does." "Oh, it matters to me," Samuel said fiercely. "You deserve better than more gossip, more judgment. You deserve—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "What do I deserve?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious what he saw when he looked at her. "Everything," he said simply. "A real home, security, respect, children laughing in the yard. A husband who comes home to you each night instead of—" He gestured helplessly at their arrangement. The word husband hung between them like a challenge. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thomas gave me those things, or tried to. The home was taken. The security was an illusion. The respect vanished with his heartbeat." She met his eyes steadily. "What you've given me, honest work, dignity, friendship, that's worth more than all the proper arrangements in the world." Samuel stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in white silence. "You don't understand," he said to the glass. "Every night, I lie there thinking about you just beyond that wall, wondering if you're warm enough, if you're sleeping peacefully. Fighting the urge to—" "To what?" Margaret had risen too, moving closer. He turned to face her, anguish clear on his features. "To offer you everything I have, little as it is, to ask you to stay not as my housekeeper but as—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But that's selfish. You're still grieving Thomas. You're dependent on my charity. It wouldn't be right." "Samuel Hayes," Margaret said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have been cold, starving, and cast out by people I thought were friends. I have walked until my feet bled and nearly died in a snowstorm. Do you really think I'm so fragile that I don't know my own mind?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to feel his breath quicken. "I mourn Thomas. Yes, I'll always carry that sorrow. But I'm not dead, Samuel, and neither are you, no matter how hard we've both tried to pretend otherwise." For a long moment, they stood suspended, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Samuel's control cracked. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Margaret," he breathed, and in that single word was a question, a prayer. A promise. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing. I'm not asking for forever, she whispered. I'm just asking for the chance to live again, to feel again. Can't we allow ourselves that much? His other hand framed her face, tilting it up. You terrify me, he admitted. I built these walls so carefully, convinced myself I was content alone. Then you arrived, half dead and shivering, and suddenly none of it mattered. The walls, the solitude, the safety of not caring. You walked through it all like it was morning mist. You saved my life, Margaret said, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. But more than that, you gave me reason to be grateful for it. Do you understand? You made me want to live again, not just survive. The kiss, when it came, was inevitable as sunrise, gentle, almost reverent, a question asked and answered in the soft press of lips. Margaret's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her palms. When they parted, both were trembling. This changes things, Samuel said unnecessarily. Margaret laughed, surprising them both. Everything's been changing since you found me in the snow. We're just finally admitting it. He pulled her close, resting his chin on her hair. She fit against him perfectly, as if they'd been carved from complementary pieces of wood. The town will talk, he warned. They'll say I took advantage, that you're... He couldn't finish the ugly thought. Let them talk, Margaret said into his shirt. We know the truth. That's enough. They stood holding each other as the fire burned low. Two people who had thought themselves beyond redemption, finding grace in unexpected places. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, spring had somehow found its way into their carefully guarded hearts. Eventually, propriety and ingrained habit reasserted themselves. They parted reluctantly. Margaret to her small room, Samuel to his bed. But everything had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something new and fragile and full of promise. Through the thin wall, each was aware of the other, breathing, existing, hoping. Margaret pressed her hand against the rough boards, imagining she could feel Samuel's warmth through the wood. On the other side, unknown to her, Samuel's palm rested in the exact same spot. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be discussions of propriety, of futures, of what came next. But tonight, in this cabin carved from wilderness and warmed by more than fire, two broken souls had taken the first tentative steps toward wholeness. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. Now, perhaps, they could build something more, a life, a future, a love strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The winter was far from over, but in their hearts, the thaw had already begun. The trip to Cedar Ridge became necessary when the salt ran low and Samuel's ammunition dwindled. He'd put it off for weeks, but February brought no respite from the cold, and their supplies couldn't stretch much further. I'll go alone, he said over breakfast, not meeting Margaret's eyes. No need for you to face that. Margaret set down her coffee cup with deliberate calm. We both know what they'll say when they see me with you. Might as well get it over with. Margaret, I won't hide, Samuel. Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to recognize, stubborn as the mountains themselves. I've done nothing wrong, neither have we. He wanted to argue, to protect her from the cruel whispers and cutting looks he knew awaited them. But he also understood her pride, the need to face the world rather than cower from it. All right, he said finally. But we stay together. No wandering off alone. The morning they left dawned clear and bitter cold. Margaret wore his mother's dress, altered to fit properly, with a wool shawl he'd bought from a traveling peddler. She looked respectable, even pretty with color in her cheeks and her hair neatly pinned. Only Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the wagon seat. Cedar Ridge appeared after 2 hours of silent travel, smoke rising from chimneys, the general store's false front trying to impose civilization on wilderness. Samuel helped Margaret down from the wagon, his hand lingering on her elbow. Remember, he said quietly, they only have the power we give them. The first stairs came immediately, Mrs. Henderson, sweeping her porch, froze mid-motion. Her mouth opened, closed, then pursed into a line thin as paper. Across the street, two men loading lumber stopped to gawk openly. Samuel kept his hand on Margaret's elbow, guiding her toward Morrison's general store. The bell above the door jangled their arrival into sudden silence. James Morrison himself stood behind the counter, his face cycling through surprise, calculation, and disapproval. "Hayes," he said carefully. Then his eyes slid to Margaret. "Mrs. Sullivan." "Morrison." Samuel's voice was steady as granite. "Need salt, coffee, ammunition, the usual." "Of course." Morrison moved to fill the order, but his attention kept returning to Margaret. "Heard you disappeared after your troubles. Mrs. Sullivan." Folks were worried. Margaret's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Were they? How kind of them to worry after they'd taken everything and turned me out." Color rose in Morrison's face. Behind them, the bell jangled again. Mrs. Patterson entered with her daughter, stopping short at the sight of Margaret. "Mercy preserve us." Mrs. Patterson breathed, clutching her daughter's arm. "Margaret Sullivan, as I live and breathe, we thought you were dead." "Sorry to disappoint," Margaret said coolly. "Mrs. Patterson's eyes darted between Margaret and Samuel, her expression sharpening with ugly understanding. "I see. Well, I suppose a woman must survive however she can." The insinuation hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's hand tightened on the counter, knuckles white. "Mrs. Sullivan is my housekeeper," he said, his voice carrying warning. "She keeps house in exchange for room and board, all proper and above board." "I'm sure." "Mrs. Patterson said, her tone suggesting anything but. "Still, people will talk. A young widow, a bachelor rancher, alone out there." She shook her head with false concern. "It doesn't look right, Mr. Hayes. Surely you can see that." "What I see," Samuel said slowly, "is a town that turned its back on a grieving widow, left her to starve or freeze, and now dares to judge her for surviving." He turned to face Mrs. Patterson fully. "Tell me, ma'am, where was your Christian charity when the bank took her home? Where was your concern when she had nowhere to turn?" "Mrs. Patterson's face flushed. "That's hardly what? Your responsibility? Your problem?" Samuel's voice never rose, but something in it made Mrs. Patterson step back. "You're right, it wasn't. It was mine, and I did what any decent man would do. If that offends your delicate sensibilities, perhaps you should examine why." The store had filled gradually, drawn by the spectacle. Margaret recognized faces, people she'd once called neighbors, who'd smiled when Thomas was alive. Now they looked at her with mixtures of pity, disgust, and cruel fascination. A rough voice cut through the tension. Well, the widow Sullivan." Jake Watson shouldered through the crowd, already half drunk though it was barely noon. He'd made advances after Thomas died, growing angry when she refused. His eyes traveled over her with possession that made her skin crawl. "Looking healthy. Margaret, real healthy." He swayed closer, breath sour with whiskey. "Guess you found yourself a protector after all. Smart girl, though you could have saved yourself the trouble. Taken my offer." Samuel moved so fast Watson had no time to react. One moment he was leering at Margaret. The next, Samuel had him by the shirt front, slamming him against the wall hard enough to rattle goods on nearby shelves. "You'll address her as Mrs. Sullivan," Samuel said, his voice deadly quiet. "And you'll do it with respect, or you won't do it at all. Understand?" Watson's eyes bulged, hands scrabbling at Samuel's grip. "Can't breathe." "Samuel," Margaret touched his arm gently. "He's not worth it." For a moment, Samuel didn't move. Then, slowly, he released Watson, who slumped against the wall, gasping. "You touch her, speak to her, even look at her wrong," Samuel said, "and I'll forget I'm a civilized man. Clear?" Watson nodded frantically, scrambling for the door. The crowd parted to let him pass. then turned back to stare at Samuel and Margaret with renewed interest. Morrison cleared his throat. "Your goods. Hayes." He pushed the supplies across the counter, clearly eager to end the scene. "That'll be $2. Samuel paid without haggling, gathering the supplies. As they turned to leave, Margaret held her head high, meeting every stare directly. Let them look, let them whisper. She'd survived worse than their judgment. Outside, she was trembling. Samuel helped her into the wagon quickly, his jaw set. As they pulled away from town, Margaret saw faces in windows, watching their departure. "I'm sorry," Samuel said once Cedar Ridge was behind them. "I shouldn't have lost my temper. Don't apologize." Margaret's voice was fierce. "They needed to see that I'm not alone anymore, not defenseless." She turned to look at him. "Though I could have handled Watson myself, I've had practice saying no to him." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "Has he bothered you before?" "After Thomas died, he seemed to think a widow would be grateful for any attention." She shuddered. "He was persistent until I hit him with a skillet." Despite everything, Samuel's mouth twitched. "A skillet? Cast iron, left quite a bump." A hysterical laugh bubbled up. "And now the whole town thinks I'm your—" She couldn't say the word. "They think what they want to think," Samuel said grimly. "Always have. Question is, do we let it matter?" They rode in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Finally, Margaret spoke. "It does matter, though your reputation—" "My reputation?" Samuel snorted. "I'm the hermit rancher who lost his whole family and went half mad with grief. They whisper about me too. Margaret, only difference is, I stopped caring years ago. This is different. A man alone is eccentric. A woman who's compromised is ruined." Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her fully. "Then marry me." The words hung between them, shocking in their suddenness. Margaret stared at him, mouth open. "I'm serious," Samuel continued, gathering courage. "We're already living as closer than some married folks. You said yourself your reputation's gone. This would make it respectable. Give you protection." "Protection?" Margaret repeated flatly. "That's why you'd marry me? For propriety?" Samuel ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "No, that's not— I'm doing this badly." He took her hands, work-roughened fingers gentle on hers. "I'd marry you because I can't imagine the cabin without you. Because I wake up thinking of you and fall asleep listening for your breathing through the wall. Because when Watson looked at you that way, I wanted to tear him apart." His voice dropped. "Because somewhere between finding you in the snow and watching you make my empty house a home, I fell in love with you. Margaret Sullivan. The respectability would just be extra." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Think about it, but know that offer stands, regardless of what the town says or does." He clicked to the horses, setting them moving again. "The West doesn't belong just to the righteous and the wealthy. It belongs to people like us too, the broken ones who keep going anyway." As the wagon rolled home through the winter afternoon, Margaret studied his profile, the strong jaw, the lines carved by sun and sorrow, the hands gentle on the reins despite their strength. She thought of the cabin waiting for them, warm and safe, of the life they'd built in these few short months. The town's judgment stung. Yes, but Samuel was right. What power did their whispers have against the solid reality of shared meals, quiet evenings, the gradual weaving together of two damaged lives into something whole? She slipped her hand into his, feeling him start with surprise, then lace his fingers through hers. "Ask me again?" she said softly. "When we're home, ask me properly." His hand tightened on hers, and though he kept his eyes on the road, she saw the smile that transformed his weathered face. They drove the rest of the way in companionable silence, hands linked, while behind them Cedar Ridge buzzed with gossip, and ahead waited their cabin, their refuge, their future. The confrontation with the town had been everything Margaret feared and more, but it had also shown her something precious, that she was no longer facing the world alone. Samuel would stand with her, fight for her, offer her not just protection but partnership. And maybe, in this harsh land that had taken so much from both of them, that was the greatest gift of all. March arrived with a vengeance, bringing blizzards that howled down from the mountains like hungry wolves. The cabin, which had seemed so sturdy and safe, groaned under the assault of wind and snow. Ice formed inside the windows, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. Samuel had lived through hard winters before, but this one tested even his experience. The horses huddled in the lean-to, requiring constant attention to ensure they didn't freeze. Each trip to tend them became a battle against nature itself. "We're running low on firewood," he announced one morning, frost still clinging to his beard despite the warmth inside. "And the meat stores are near gone. I managed to save most of the cattle, but we lost 2 calves to the cold." Margaret looked up from her mending, worry creasing her brow. They'd been married 3 weeks now. A simple ceremony with the circuit preacher who'd happened through just after their return from Cedar Ridge. The ring on her finger was plain silver, but she treasured it more than the gold band Thomas had given her. "What can I do?" she asked, setting aside the shirt. "We need to be careful with what we have," Samuel said, hanging his coat by the fire. "This storm could last another week, maybe more. The root cellar's frozen solid, can't even get the door open." They worked together to inventory their supplies, and the result was sobering. Coffee would last perhaps another week if they rationed. The flour was low, salt nearly gone, and the smoked meat down to a few tough strips. "We've survived on less," Margaret said, trying for optimism. "Remember, I arrived here with nothing at all." Samuel pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That was different. I won't see you go hungry again, not while I draw breath." But as the days passed and the storm showed no signs of abating, their situation grew increasingly dire. They melted snow for water, stretched their meals paper thin, and burned furniture they could spare to conserve firewood. The cold was a living thing, creeping through every crack, stealing warmth and hope alike. One night, as they lay together for warmth, the wind shrieking like demons outside, Samuel felt Margaret shivering uncontrollably despite the blankets piled atop them. "Here," he said, pulling her tighter against him. "We'll get through this." "I know," she whispered against his chest. "I'm not afraid. Not anymore. If I must face an end, I'm grateful it's with you." "Don't talk like that," Samuel said fiercely. "Spring will come. It always does." But privately, he wondered. He'd seen men freeze to death in storms like this, found them come spring thaw with peaceful expressions, as if death had come gentle as sleep. The thought of Margaret suffering that fate made his chest tight with fear. On the 4th day of the worst of it, they woke to relative quiet. The wind had died to a whisper, though snow still fell heavily. Samuel seized the opportunity to try hunting, desperation driving him out despite the risk. "I'll check the traps, maybe find something," he told Margaret, loading his rifle. "Keep the fire going. Don't let it die." Margaret caught his arm as he turned to go. "Be careful. I'd rather starve than lose you." He kissed her hard, pouring all his fear and love into the gesture. "I'll come back. Always." The world outside was transformed, alien in its whiteness. Drifts reached the cabin's eaves in places, and Samuel had to dig his way to the lean-to. The horses were alive, but suffering, their water frozen solid. He spent precious energy breaking ice and ensuring they had feed, knowing they'd need the animals come spring. The traps were empty, buried under feet of snow. As he struggled through drifts that came to his chest, Samuel thought he glimpsed movement in the trees. A rabbit, perhaps, or even a deer seeking shelter. He raised his rifle, hands numb with cold, and fired. The shot echoed across the frozen landscape, but he'd missed. Whatever creature had been there vanished into the white, defeated. He turned back toward home, the word taking on new meaning now that Margaret waited there. He almost missed the dark shape against the snow. A rabbit, frozen to death in the storm, preserved by the cold. It wasn't much, but it was meat. He found another a few yards away, and his heart lifted. They would eat tonight. Margaret cried when she saw the rabbits. Tears of relief rather than sorrow. They prepared the meat carefully, wasting nothing, even cracking the bones for marrow. The smell of cooking meat filled the cabin, making their mouths water. "We should save some," Margaret said even as her stomach cramped with hunger. "We'll eat our fill tonight." Samuel decided. Strength today might mean finding more food tomorrow. They dined like it was a feast, sharing stories to distract from their situation. Margaret told him about her childhood in Ohio, before her parents moved west. Samuel shared memories of cattle drives, of nights under stars so bright they hurt to look at. "When this is over," Margaret said, drowsy with the first full meal in days, "I want to plant a garden, vegetables, herbs, maybe even flowers, something beautiful to look at." "You'll have your garden," Samuel promised, stroking her hair as she leaned against him. "Big as you want. I'll build you a proper house too, with real glass windows and a wood floor." "This is proper enough," she murmured. "Home isn't the building, Samuel. It's who you share it with." The storm returned with the dawn, as if angry at their brief respite, but something had shifted. They faced it together now, truly together. No longer two people sharing space, but a united force against whatever nature threw at them. They made soup from the rabbit bones, stretched it across 3 days. When that ran out, they boiled leather strips cut from an old harness, creating a bitter broth that at least filled their stomachs. Samuel ventured out whenever the wind died, returning sometimes with a scrawny bird, sometimes with nothing but frost in his beard and apologies in his eyes. "I'm thinking too much about food," Margaret confessed one evening, her face gaunt in the firelight. "Remember that horrible gossipy tea party, Mrs. Henderson threw last spring? I'd sit through a dozen of them now for one of those awful cucumber sandwiches." Samuel laughed despite everything. "I once threw away half a plate of beans because they were too salty. Seems like the height of foolishness now." They played word games to pass the time, told every story they could remember, and when even that failed, simply held each other in silence. The hunger was a constant ache, but worse was the cold that seemed to live in their very bones. One morning, Samuel couldn't hide his weakness any longer. His hands shook as he tried to pull on his boots, and Margaret saw. "You're not going out there," she said firmly. "The horses can wait another day. You'll do them no good if you collapse in the snow." She helped him back to bed, fear sharp in her chest at how easily he acquiesced. That night, as Samuel slept fitfully beside her, Margaret made a decision. She'd seen the way he gave her larger portions, how he claimed to be full when she knew he wasn't. He was starving himself to keep her alive, and she wouldn't allow it. She waited until his breathing deepened, then carefully extracted herself from the bed. Her own weakness made her head spin, but determination drove her forward. There had to be something, anything, they'd overlooked. In the dim firelight, she searched every corner of the cabin. Behind a loose board, she found a small sack of cornmeal, forgotten from autumn. It was meager, maybe 3 cups, but it might as well have been gold. She prepared it carefully, making a thin porridge flavored with the last precious pinch of salt. When Samuel woke to the smell, his eyes widened. "Where did you—" "Hidden treasures," Margaret said, spooning the porridge into bowls. "Eat, don't argue." They savored each bite, the simple meal tasting finer than any feast. Outside, the wind seemed to be calming, the snow falling less heavily. "Listen," Samuel said suddenly. Margaret tilted her head, then heard it, the distant sound of water dripping. The thaw? Maybe, too early to tell, but hope flickered in his eyes. 2 days later, they woke to sunshine streaming through the window. The temperature had risen enough that snow slid from the roof in small avalanches. Samuel ventured out to find the drifts already beginning to settle, the world emerging from its white shroud. "We made it," he said, pulling Margaret out onto the cabin's small porch. "Look." The landscape was still more white than brown, but there were patches of earth showing through, and the sound of running water grew stronger by the hour. Birds appeared as if from nowhere, their songs almost shocking after so much silence. Margaret leaned into her husband's embrace, feeling the solid reality of him, of their survival. "We made it," she repeated, and the words were prayer and promise combined. The worst was over. They were thin, worn down to bone and will, but alive. Spring would bring challenges of its own, rebuilding what the winter had destroyed, planting Margaret's garden, facing the world beyond their cabin once more. But they would face it together, tempered by shared hardship into something stronger than either had been alone. "No more talk of dying," Samuel said into her hair. "We've got living to do." Margaret smiled, feeling the sun on her face like a blessing. "Yes," she agreed. "We certainly do." The cabin stood solid around them, no longer just shelter, but truly home, proven by storm and strengthened by love. They had given each other everything: warmth, food, hope, life itself. Now, with spring's promise in the air, they could begin to build the future they'd barely dared dream of during those dark, hungry nights. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. She had given him her heart to hold. Together, they had survived winter's worst, and nothing, not nature's fury, not the town's judgment, not their own fears, could break what had been forged in that crucible of ice and need. Spring brought more than just warmth and growing things. It brought danger in the form of men who'd survived the winter lean and desperate, willing to take what others had worked to preserve. Samuel first noticed the signs while checking his remaining cattle hoof prints that weren't his, the remnants of a campfire on the ridge overlooking the ranch. He said nothing to Margaret initially, not wanting to worry her after all they'd endured. But he began wearing his pistol even for simple chores and kept the rifle loaded by the door. The truth became impossible to hide when he found one of his steers butchered in the far pasture. Only the choice cuts taken. Rage filled him at the waist, the hide and bones left for scavengers, meat that could have fed them for weeks abandoned. "Rustlers?" Margaret asked when he told her, her face paling. "Or worse," Samuel admitted. "Desperate men do desperate things. We need to be watchful." They moved through their days with new caution. Margaret kept the shutters barred when Samuel was out working, and he never ventured far without checking the horizon repeatedly. The garden she'd dreamed of was planted, but always with one eye on the tree line. It was a warm April evening when they came. Margaret was inside preparing supper while Samuel tended the horses. The first indication of trouble was Tempest's nervous whinny, followed by the sound of multiple horses approaching. Samuel stepped out of the lean-to, hand resting on his pistol. 3 men sat their horses in his yard, and he recognized the type immediately. Drifters, hard-faced and hollow-eyed, the kind the war had made and never unmade. "Evening," the leader said, a scarred man with pale eyes that never stopped moving. "Nice place you got here." "Private property," Samuel replied evenly. "What's your business?" "Now that's unfriendly." The man smiled, showing gaps where teeth should be. "We're just travelers, looking for a meal and maybe a dry place to sleep. Christian charity and all that. Town's 10 miles south. They've got a boarding house." The second man, younger but no less dangerous looking, laughed. "Ain't got money for no boarding house. Friend. But seems like you got plenty here. Cattle, horses. Pretty little wife glimpsed through the window." Samuel's blood turned to ice. "You need to leave. Now." "Or what?" The leader leaned forward in his saddle. "You'll take on 3 of us. Don't be a fool. Friend. Share what you got willing. And we'll be on our way come morning. Fight us." He shrugged eloquently. The cabin door opened, and Margaret stepped out. Samuel wanted to shout at her to get back inside, but she moved with calm purpose, the shotgun in her hands held with surprising expertise. "My husband asked you to leave," she said, her voice steady as bedrock. "I won't ask as nicely." The men exchanged glances, reassessing. A woman who could handle a gun changed the mathematics of their plan. "No need for unpleasantness, ma'am," the leader said. but his hand drifted toward his holster. "Touch that iron and I'll cut you in half," Margaret said conversationally. "This scattergun's loaded with buckshot. Even if your friends get us, you'll be too dead to care." Samuel had never loved her more than in that moment, fierce as a she-wolf defending her den, transformed from the broken woman he'd found in the snow. The tension stretched taut, everyone calculating odds and consequences. The third man, silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "Frank, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Carl!" The leader, Frank, snarled, but Samuel saw the uncertainty creeping in. They'd expected easy prey, not armed resistance. "I'll make you a deal," Samuel said, seizing the moment. "There's a deer carcass hanging in the smoke shed, and some cornbread from supper. Take it and go. But if I see you on my land again, we won't talk first." Frank's eyes narrowed, pride warring with pragmatism. Finally, he nodded. "Carl, get the food." The youngest rider dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible. Margaret tracked him with the shotgun as he retrieved the offered provisions. Samuel had rarely felt minutes stretch so long. Once Carl was remounted, supplies tied to his saddle. Frank touched his hat mockingly. "Appreciate the hospitality, but this ain't over. Man shouldn't have more than he can protect." They wheeled their horses and left at an easy pace, showing they weren't running. Samuel didn't lower his pistol until they were out of sight, and even then, he knew they'd be back. "Inside," he said tersely. Margaret nodded, backing toward the door without lowering the shotgun. Once barricaded in the cabin, the adrenaline hit. Margaret's hands shook as she set the gun aside, and Samuel pulled her close. "Where did you learn to handle a shotgun like that?" "My father taught me, back in Ohio. Said a woman should know how to defend herself." She laughed shakily. "I've never pointed one at a man before." "You were magnificent." He kissed her fiercely. "But they'll be back. Men like that don't forgive being faced down, especially by a woman." They spent a sleepless night, taking turns at watch. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. They could abandon the ranch, head for town, but that meant giving up everything they'd built. He could ride for help, but that meant leaving Margaret alone. Every option seemed worse than the last. Dawn came without incident, but the reprieve felt temporary. They went about morning chores with the weapons close at hand, the brightness of spring mocking their fear. It was Margaret who spotted the smoke. "Samuel, look." A black column rose from the direction of the Hendricks place, 5 miles east. Samuel's jaw clenched. The Hendricks were an older couple. No children left at home. Easy targets. "Could be they're just burning brush," Margaret said hopefully, but they both knew better. By noon, the smoke had died away. Samuel made his decision. "I'm riding over to check. Not alone. Margaret, not alone." Her gray eyes flashed. "We face this together, or not at all." He knew that look. New argument was futile. They saddled 2 horses, armed themselves, and rode toward whatever horror awaited. The Hendricks place was a smoking ruin. The barn still smoldered, and the house was reduced to blackened timbers. They found Abel Hendricks in the yard, shot twice, his wife Sarah nearby. She'd been treated roughly before they killed her. Samuel tried to shield Margaret from the sight, but she pushed past him. "Animals," she whispered, then louder. "Animals." They covered the bodies with what they could find, Samuel saying a few words over the graves they dug. The work was hard and sorrowful, made worse by the knowledge that this could be them next. "We can't fight them alone," Margaret said as they prepared to leave. "We need help." "From who? The town that turned you out? The law that's 3 days' ride away?" Margaret's chin lifted. "Then we make our own law. The Johnsons, the Millers, even the Taylors, they've all got stakes in stopping men like this. We unite, or we all fall separately." Samuel studied his wife, seeing new steel in her spine. The frontier had a way of stripping people down to their core truth. Margaret's was stronger than anyone had guessed. They rode through the night, stopping at every neighboring ranch. The story was the same at each. Folks had seen the riders, heard rumors, felt the threat. By dawn, they'd gathered at the Miller place, 6 families, 23 souls total, united by common danger. They hit the Hendricks place. Samuel announced to the gathered group, "Burn them out, kill them both. They'll strike again." Tom Johnson, a burly ex-soldier, spoke up. "Then we strike first, hunt them down like the dogs they are." "And leave our homes undefended?" Mary Miller protested. "What about the children?" Arguments broke out, fear and anger warring for dominance. Margaret stood, and something in her presence commanded silence. "We post guards," she said calmly. "Work our places in groups, no one alone, ever. And we send riders to town, to the marshal, to anyone who'll listen. But most importantly, we stand together. They're counting on our isolation, our fear. We show them they miscalculated." The plan took shape quickly. The women and children would gather at the Miller place, most defensible with its stone walls. The men would patrol in shifts, checking on each spread, ready to converge if trouble showed. As they prepared to disperse, old Walter Taylor pulled Samuel aside. "Your wife's got sand. Hayes might have misjudged her before. She's full of surprises." Samuel agreed, watching Margaret organize the women with quiet efficiency. They returned to their cabin to gather necessities for Margaret's stay at the Millers. As she packed, Samuel caught her arm. "I want you safe," he said. "If something happens, nothing will happen." She cupped his face, thumb tracing the worry lines. "You'll be careful, and you'll come back to me. We've survived too much to lose each other now." He kissed her deeply, trying to pour all his love and fear and determination into the contact. When they parted, her eyes were wet but resolute. "Go," she said. "Protect what we've built. I'll be waiting when it's done." The confrontation came 2 nights later. The outlaws, perhaps sensing the changed dynamics, struck at the Johnson place. But instead of finding a single family, they met 6 armed men in a fury born of righteous anger. The battle was brief but vicious. When the gun smoke cleared, 2 outlaws lay dead, including Frank. The third, Carl, was captured. Just a boy, really, crying and begging for mercy he'd never shown others. They took him to town, to face whatever justice could be found there. Samuel felt no satisfaction in victory, only relief that the threat had passed. He rode hard for the Miller place, needing to see Margaret, to know she was safe. She met him in the yard, flying into his arms with such force he staggered. "It's done," he murmured into her hair. "It's over. Thank God." She breathed. Thank God for stubborn men and brave women and neighbors who remember what community means. Later, as they rode home through the spring evening, Samuel marveled at how much had changed. The cabin came into view, whole and welcoming, smoke rising peaceful from the chimney. "We should help the Hendricks kin," Margaret said. "When they come to settle affairs, and I want to plant flowers on Sarah's grave. She loved her roses." "We will," Samuel promised. "Whatever needs doing." They unsaddled the horses in companionable silence. The simple domestic task, a blessing after so much violence. Inside, Margaret set about making coffee while Samuel secured the cabin habits that would likely linger long after the danger had passed. "We're different now," Margaret observed, watching him check the rifle's load. "Both of us. This place has changed us. Made us harder?" "No," she considered. "Stronger. There's a difference." She moved into his arms, fitting against him like she belonged there. "I was so frightened, not of dying, but of losing you, of losing this life we're building. But you stood firm, organized the defense, faced down 3 armed men with more courage than most soldiers I've known. We protected what's ours," Margaret said simply. "Our home, our community, our future. That's what the frontier demands. Not just surviving, but defending the right to thrive." Samuel thought of the woman he'd found in the snow, broken, desperate, ready to surrender to the cold. That woman was gone, forged into something new by hardship and hope alike. In her place stood his wife, his partner, his equal in all things. "No more running," he said. "No more hiding from the world. We make our stand here. Together, Margaret agreed, and sealed it with a kiss. Outside, the spring evening settled soft over the land. The garden showed green shoots of promise. The cattle lowed peacefully in their pasture, and somewhere a nightbird began its serenade. They'd won the right to this peace through blood and courage, and they would guard it jealously. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. She had given him her strength to endure. Together, they'd proven that even in this harsh land, love could not only survive but flourish. Growing stronger with each test passed, the frontier would throw more challenges their way, drought and storm, loss and hardship. But they would meet them as they had met these outlaws, united, unafraid, and unbreakable. Summer arrived with abundance, as if nature sought to compensate for winter's cruelty. Margaret's garden flourished beyond her hopes, rows of beans and corn, squash vines sprawling in the sun, herbs scenting the air. The cabin, once stark and utilitarian, now boasted small touches of comfort. Curtains she'd sewn from fabric bought with egg money, wildflowers in a jar on the table, a rag rug by the hearth. Together, they expanded the ranch. Samuel built a chicken coop while Margaret tended the new flock, delighting in the daily treasure hunt for eggs. They worked side by side, raising the frame of a new barn, their movements synchronized through months of partnership. "We should go to church," Margaret announced one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance in the dusk. Together, properly. Samuel's hand stilled on the wood he was whittling. "You sure? After how they treated you?" "That was before. We're married now, established. The Johnsons and Millers will stand with us after what we've been through together." She turned to face him. "I won't hide anymore. Samuel, we've earned our place here." He studied her face, seeing the determination that had become so familiar. "All right, this Sunday, then." Saturday evening found Margaret pressing her good dress, the blue wool that had been his mother's, while Samuel trimmed his beard and attempted to tame his hair. They were like young courters preparing for a dance, nervous energy filling the cabin. "Do I look respectable?" Margaret asked, turning before him. "You look beautiful," Samuel said honestly. "Too good for the likes of me." She swatted his arm. "Don't start that. We clean up well together." Sunday dawned clear and bright. They hitched the wagon early, wanting to arrive neither too early nor too late. As Cedar Ridge came into view, Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. "Steady," Samuel murmured. "Remember what you told the others. We face things together." The church was a simple white building with a modest steeple, already filling with families. As their wagon pulled up, conversation stuttered to a halt. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of eyes, the quick calculations being made. Tom Johnson broke the silence, striding over with his wife, Catherine. "Hayes, Mrs. Hayes, good to see you." His handshake was firm, his message clear. They were under his protection. Others followed suit, some warmer than others. The Millers, the Taylors. Even some who'd been cool before now offered cautious greetings. The shared danger of spring had redrawn some social lines, but not all. Mrs. Patterson swept past with her nose elevated, pulling her daughter away when the girl seemed inclined to speak. Morrison from the general store gave the briefest nod possible, and Jake Watson, sporting a fading bruise from some other altercation, glared from across the churchyard. "Ignore them," Catherine Johnson advised quietly. Some folks would rather nurse their spite than admit they were wrong. Inside the church, Samuel guided Margaret to a pew midway back, not presuming to the front rows where established families sat, but not skulking in the rear either. As they settled, Margaret was aware of the rustling and whispering around them. Reverend Davis, a young man new to the territory, began the service with enthusiasm. His sermon touched on forgiveness and community, themes that seemed particularly pointed given the congregation's dynamics. When it came time for hymns, Margaret's clear voice rose with the others. She'd always loved to sing, though there'd been little cause for it recently. Samuel, tone-deaf but game, rumbled along beside her, making her hide a smile. It was during the final prayer that the moment came. Reverend Davis asked for God's blessings on the congregation, then added, "And we give special thanks for the safe delivery of all our families through winter's trials and spring's dangers. May we remember that in unity there is strength, and in forgiveness, grace." "Amen," the congregation responded, and Margaret felt something shift, subtle but real. Not acceptance, perhaps, but a crack in the wall of judgment. After the service, as folks gathered in the churchyard, several women approached Margaret. Mary Miller was first, her manner warm. "That cornbread recipe you shared was a blessing. My John asks for it twice a week now. Happy to share more." Margaret replied, "I've been experimenting with herbs from the garden." Soon a small circle formed, discussing preserving techniques and gardening challenges. Samuel, meanwhile, found himself drawn into conversation about cattle prices and grazing rights. It was almost, Margaret thought with wonder, like being part of the community. Mrs. Patterson made one last attempt to poison the well, her voice carrying deliberately. "Well, I suppose we must be charitable to everyone, mustn't we? Even those who've shown questionable judgment." A hush fell. Margaret felt Samuel tense beside her, but she touched his arm gently. This was her battle. "Indeed we must, Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said clearly. "After all, none of us knows when we might need that charity ourselves. Why, just this winter, I heard several families might have starved without neighbors' help. And of course, poor Sarah Hendricks. If only she'd had more charity in her final moments." The reminder of the recent violence, of how precarious all their lives were, hit home. Mrs. Patterson flushed, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Judge not," Mary Miller murmured, just loud enough to carry, "lest you be judged." Mrs. Patterson retreated in disorder, and conversation resumed. But Margaret noticed the looks, some approving, some reassessing. She'd shown she could defend herself with words as well as shotguns. The ride home was quiet, both processing the morning's events. "That went better than expected," Samuel finally offered. "It's a start," Margaret agreed. "We'll go back next week and the week after. Eventually, they'll get tired of watching us like a circus act." "And Mrs. Patterson?" Margaret smiled. "We'll find someone else to disapprove of. Women like her always do." They continued attending church regularly, and slowly, incrementally, the community adjusted. Margaret joined the quilting circle, bringing her fine needlework and quiet humor. Samuel was recruited for barn raisings and cattle drives. When the harvest social came in September, they danced together in the church hall, no longer outsiders, but part of the fabric of Cedar Ridge. The transformation wasn't complete. Some would always whisper about the widow who'd lived with a bachelor, married or not. But Margaret had been right. People grew tired of old scandals when new ones presented themselves, and their steady presence, their obvious devotion to each other and willingness to help neighbors, spoke louder than old gossip. One Sunday in late October, as they prepared for church, Samuel presented Margaret with a gift, a proper gold wedding band. "I've been saving," he explained, suddenly shy. "Wanted you to have something fitting." Margaret's eyes filled as he slipped it onto her finger alongside the simple silver band. "Samuel Hayes, you romantic fool. Only for you," he said, kissing her gently. "Only ever for you." That morning, Mrs. Patterson's daughter Ellen approached Margaret after service. "Mrs. Hayes, I wanted to apologize for before. Mother says I shouldn't speak to you. But what you did, standing up to those outlaws, it was brave." Margaret studied the girl, 17, maybe 18, with her mother's features but softer eyes. "Thank you. Ellen, that means a great deal. I'm to be married next month." Ellen continued in a rush. "To Daniel Cooper from the Double C Ranch. And I wondered, that is, would you help me with my dress? Everyone says your needlework is the finest in the county." It was an olive branch, and more, a public acknowledgement of Margaret's skills and place. "I'd be honored," Margaret said warmly. Mrs. Patterson looked ready to combust when she discovered the arrangement, but public opinion had shifted too far. Her daughter's wedding dress, with Margaret's exquisite embroidery, was proclaimed the finest anyone had seen. Even the sternest matrons had to admit the widow Hayes had talent. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The root cellar was full, firewood stacked high, the new barn sheltering hay and livestock. When the first snows fell, Margaret and Samuel stood together on their porch, his arms around her from behind, watching the flakes drift down. "Different from last year," he murmured into her hair. "Everything's different." Margaret agreed. "We're different." Inside the warm cabin, evidence of their shared life was everywhere. His books mingled with hers on the shelf, her sewing basket beside his leather-working tools, 2 chairs pulled close by the fire instead of one. "No regrets?" Samuel asked, as he sometimes did when the memories pressed close. Margaret turned in his arms, reaching up to trace the lines that sun and sorrow had carved in his beloved face. "How could I regret the path that brought me to you? Even the pain, the loss, it's all part of our story." They went inside together, leaving the cold behind. The fire was bright, soup simmered on the stove, and the quilt she'd sewn from scraps of both their lives lay across the bed they shared. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: animals to tend, meals to prepare, the endless work of maintaining their small piece of the frontier. They'd go to church on Sunday. Margaret would work on a new dress for the banker's wife. Samuel would meet with the other ranchers about next year's drive. But tonight, they were simply themselves, 2 people who'd found each other in the most unlikely way, who'd built from ruins something stronger than what came before. The town's acceptance, hard-won and gradual, was sweet. But sweeter still was this moment, this life, this love that had grown from frozen ground into something that could weather any storm. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. She had given him her heart to hold. And in the giving and receiving, they'd found not just survival, but abundance, not just acceptance, but belonging to each other, to the land, to the community that had finally opened its arms to embrace them. The circle was complete. The story still being written with each passing day, each small victory, each shared sunset on the porch of the home they'd built with their own hands and hearts. The summer afternoon stretched golden across the Montana Valley, the kind of day that made the hardships of frontier life seem like distant dreams. Margaret stood in her flourishing garden, basket in hand, selecting the ripest tomatoes for supper. The plants had grown tall and strong, their fruit heavy on the vine, a testament to careful tending and rich soil. From the new barn came the rhythmic sound of Samuel's hammer as he worked on building proper stalls for their expanding horse herd. They'd prospered this past year, their cattle multiplying, their reputation as reliable neighbors firmly established. The cabin had grown too, a proper bedroom added on, real glass windows installed, and a wooden floor that didn't creak with every step. "Margaret," Samuel called from the barn, "come see what I've made." She set down her basket and walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. Inside the barn, amid the sweet smell of fresh hay and sawdust, stood a beautiful wooden cradle. "Samuel," she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth pine. "It's beautiful." He came up behind her, arms encircling her waist, hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. "Figured we'd be needing it come winter." They stood together in the filtered sunlight, contemplating the future growing between them. Margaret had suspected for weeks, but had only told Samuel when she was certain. His joy had been overwhelming, lifting her off her feet, spinning her around until she laughed and demanded he put her down. "Are you happy?" he asked now, as he often did, still seeming amazed by their good fortune. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Margaret assured him, leaning back into his strength. "Though I'll be happier still when this little one stops making me sick every morning." Samuel chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Mother always said that meant a healthy baby." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Samuel stepped protectively in front of Margaret, hand moving instinctively toward where his gun would be. Old habits dying hard, but the riders were familiar. Tom and Catherine Johnson, with young Ellen Cooper, nee Patterson, beside them. "Afternoon, folks." Tom called out cheerfully. "Hope we're not interrupting." "Not at all," Samuel replied, relaxing. "What brings you our way?" Catherine dismounted with practiced ease. "Women's business," she said with a knowing smile. "Ellen and I thought Margaret might like some company, and perhaps some advice about certain matters." Margaret flushed slightly but smiled. News traveled fast in a small community, and her condition was becoming obvious. "I'd welcome both. Samuel was just showing me his handiwork." Ellen peeked into the barn, gasping at the sight of the cradle. "Oh, Mr. Hayes, it's lovely. Daniel could never make something so fine. He's all thumbs with anything but rope and saddle." "Samuel's always been clever with his hands," Margaret said proudly. "Come inside. I'll make tea." As the women headed for the cabin, Tom clapped Samuel on the shoulder. "Congratulations, friend. About time this place heard the sound of little feet." Inside, the women settled around the table Margaret had covered with a cheerful cloth. The cabin was transformed from its bachelor beginnings, braided rugs on the floor, preserves lining the shelves, books and sewing baskets creating a lived-in comfort. "I brought some of Michael's old baby clothes," Catherine said, producing a bundle from her bag. "He's outgrown them, and they're too good to waste." Margaret fingered the tiny garments, tears threatening. "Thank you. That's so kind. We look after each other out here," Ellen said firmly. "Mother may have her opinions, but I make my own choices now, and I choose to help my friends." It was a declaration of independence as much as friendship, and Margaret squeezed the younger woman's hand gratefully. They spent the afternoon discussing babies and birthing, remedies for morning sickness, and plans for the future. "Doc Morrison from Bozeman makes rounds every few months," Catherine advised. "But mostly we women help each other when the time comes. I assisted at a dozen births before Michael arrived." "I'll be glad of any help," Margaret admitted. "I know so little about babies." "You'll learn," Ellen assured her. "We all do. And you'll have Samuel. He'll be a wonderful father. The way he looks at you. Daniel says he's never seen a man so devoted." As evening approached, their visitors took their leave. Margaret and Samuel stood on the porch, watching them ride away, the setting sun painting the mountains purple and gold. "Good people," Samuel observed. "The best," Margaret agreed. "I'm glad our child will grow up knowing such neighbors." They went inside to prepare supper together, moving around each other with practiced ease. As Margaret sliced bread and Samuel dished up stew, she found herself marveling at the simple domesticity of it all. A year and a half ago, she'd been ready to die in the snow. Now she carried new life, surrounded by love and community. After supper, they sat on the porch as was their custom, Samuel whittling while Margaret worked on tiny baby clothes. The evening was warm, crickets singing their summer song, the mountains standing eternal guard over their valley. "I've been thinking," Samuel said slowly, "about names." "Oh?" Margaret smiled. "And what has my thoughtful husband decided?" "Thomas for a boy," he said quietly. "If you'd like to honor him." Margaret's hand stilled. She looked at Samuel's profile, seeing no jealousy or resentment, only the generous heart that had taken in a desperate stranger and made her whole again. "You'd do that? He was a good man who loved you well. Our son should know that love can take many forms, that families can be built from both joy and sorrow." He glanced at her. "Unless it would pain you." "No," Margaret said softly, reaching for his hand. "It would honor me. And for a girl?" "Sarah," they said in unison, then laughed. "Your sister," Margaret said. "The little girl who called you Sammy?" "She would have loved being an aunt," Samuel said wistfully. "Would have spoiled the baby terribly." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered, fireflies beginning their evening dance. Inside Margaret, the baby moved, a flutter like butterfly wings, still new enough to be miraculous. "We need to finish the cradle," she said. "It needs a mattress, blankets." "Plenty of time," Samuel assured her. Though I might build a rocking chair too. I remember my mother rocking Sarah for hours. I love you, Margaret said suddenly, overwhelmed by the sweetness of this ordinary moment. I love this life we've built. Samuel set aside his whittling, pulling her close. No more than I love you, my Margaret, my miracle, my heart. As if in response to their contentment, a coyote howled in the distance. Not a threat now, just another voice in the wilderness they'd claimed as home. The stars emerged one by one, brilliant in the clear mountain air. And somewhere, an owl called to its mate. We should go in, Margaret said eventually. Early morning tomorrow. But they lingered a moment longer, reluctant to break the spell. This porch, these mountains, this life carved from hardship and hope. It was more than either had dared dream when fate threw them together in a winter storm. Finally, Samuel stood, helping Margaret to her feet with extra care. Inside, the cabin welcomed them with warmth and lamplight. As Margaret prepared for bed, Samuel banked the fire and secured the door rituals of safety and home that had become sacred in their simplicity. Later, as they lay together in the bed they'd shared as husband and wife for over a year now, Samuel's hand rested protectively over the life growing within her. No regrets, he asked, as was his habit. Only one, Margaret said, and felt him tense. That we can't have a dozen more just like this one. His laughter rumbled through the darkness. Let's start with one and see how we manage. Coward, she teased, then yawned. Though after today's wisdom from Catherine and Ellen, perhaps you're right. Sleep came easily now, without the fear and hunger that had once kept them wakeful. Margaret's dreams were of gardens and baby laughter, of summer afternoons and winter evenings by the fire, of a life stretching ahead filled with ordinary miracles. Beside her, Samuel dreamed too of teaching small hands to gentle a horse, of bedtime stories and birthday celebrations, of the family neither thought they'd have finding its way to completion. The cabin stood solid against the night, no longer a bachelor's retreat or a desperate shelter, but a true home. In the barn, the cradle waited for its occupant. In the garden, vegetables grew heavy on the vine. And in the bed given in mercy to a freezing stranger, 2 hearts beat as one, no, 3 hearts now, the smallest just beginning its rhythm. The rancher had given her his bed to rest. She had given him reason to hope again. Together, they had built something neither could have imagined in their darkest hours, a love strong enough to transform loss into blessing, a home spacious enough for dreams, a future bright enough to chase away the shadows of the past. Come winter, a child's cry would echo across the snow-covered valley, announcing new life where once there had been only survival. The circle of their story, begun in desperation and continued through courage, would find its perfect completion in the most ordinary and extraordinary of ways. A family, whole and happy, facing whatever came with hands joined and hearts united. The West had tested them with its worst. Now it would witness their best. The legacy of love born from ashes. The triumph of hope over hardship. The simple glory of lives well lived on the frontier that had made them who they were meant to be. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope it touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you. Where are you listening from today? Please leave a comment below to let me know. I'd love to connect with fellow Western romance enthusiasts from around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more heartwarming frontier tales. And please share your thoughts about Margaret and Samuel's journey in the comments. Your support means everything.